This coming Sunday, August 6th, and Wednesday, August 9th, are the anniversaries of the U.S. bombing of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II in 1945. Monstrous war crimes, and the first and to this day the only time nuclear weapons have been used. This anniversary is happening at a moment when the movie Oppenheimer just came out, a film about the scientists who led the Manhattan Project in developing the atomic bomb that was dropped on these cities. This film is raising big questions about the existential danger of nuclear weapons, even as it refuses to reckon with the true horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and actually rationalizes it as a tough but necessary decision. This is bullshit, and we'll explain why, and show you what really happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This anniversary is also happening in a moment when the U.S. is waging a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. In other words, a war they are not fighting directly, but by training and arming Ukrainian troops against Russia. And at the same time, the U.S. is making increasing threats against China. This is a moment when the danger of direct war between these imperialist powers, of World War III and nuclear annihilation, is greater than it's been in decades. A moment where there is an urgent need for people to wake up to what is happening, to stop siding with the U.S. in its imperialist wars, and to get organized for revolution to overthrow this capitalist imperialist system. We need and we demand a whole new system based on the Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America. This new socialist government would never use weapons of mass destruction and would instead work to abolish nuclear weapons everywhere as part of the struggle to end all forms of oppression and exploitation and finally get to a world without war. On August 6th, join the Revcoms in cities across the country to declare no more. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the U.S. were crimes against humanity. No war with Russia. Stop U.S. threats against China. No World War III. It's this system, not humanity, that must become extinct. We don't accept their future. It's time to get organized for a real revolution. With all that in mind, let's look back at what the U.S. did 78 years ago, which they have never apologized for.
On August 6, 1945, a blazing, million-degree fireball suddenly appeared just above the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly killing, burning alive, or vaporizing tens of thousands. Firestorms engulfed the city. Shockwaves and winds over 1,000 miles an hour came next, shattering bodies and buildings, hurling men, women, and children through the air. Nearly all structures were destroyed over a mile from ground zero. There were red, burned, and bloated dead bodies piled up high. The corpses with the guts and the eyes popped out. Clouds of dust turned the morning into twilight, and later, black rain fell. This is from American Crime Case number 97, August 6th and 9th, 1945, the nuclear incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The U.S. had just exploded the first nuclear bomb over the center of a city of 350,000 people. Thousands who survived the blast soon experienced fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, hair and skin loss, and soon death from radiation sickness. By the end of 1945, between 140,000 and 150,000 people, overwhelmingly civilians, had perished in Hiroshima. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded. 3 days later, on August 9th, the U.S. dropped an even more powerful nuclear bomb on Nagasaki, destroying the city and murdering another 70,000 people. The rulers of the U.S. claim that dropping these atrocious bombs on Japan was necessary to end the war quickly and save American lives. This blatant lie and the disgusting American chauvinist mentality that anything is justified, including mass murdering hundreds of thousands of innocent people in the name of saving Americans, this is still repeated and believed by way too many people to this day. So we need to talk about the real reason the U.S. perpetrated this crime against humanity. This clip we're about to watch was part of a recent event at Revolution Books in New York City. A speech by Raymond Latta titled "Robert Oppenheimer Served America's Empire. We have the responsibility and possibility to end this horror and bring a far better world into being." You can watch the whole thing at revolutionbooksnyc.org.
We come to the decision by the U.S. to drop the atom bomb on Japan. Was that decision guided by the military requirements of defeating Japan? The truth is that Japan had already suffered major military setbacks. The truth is that Japan had sent messages through diplomatic channels indicating that it was willing to surrender. The truth is there was no direct military value in destroying Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities that were largely civilian centers. No, the dropping of the atom bomb was an act of what the historian Gar Alperovitz has called atomic diplomacy. The Soviet Union had reached an understanding with the U.S., England, and France that it would invade Japan in 1945. But the U.S. wanted to make sure that it had total control over the development of Japan after the war. The dropping of the atom bomb was a statement. It was a warning. It was a threat to the then socialist Soviet Union that U.S. imperialism was calling the shots and would put up with no interference in the post-World War II world. The dropping of this horrific weapon was also a message to the whole world. The U.S. had come out of World War II as the top imperialist gangster. The U.S. was telling the world, don't mess with us, or this is what you might get. Now let's go back to Robert Oppenheimer and the development of the atom bomb. The film Oppenheimer tells the story of how he and the scientists who worked on the atom bomb thought they were doing this as a blow for democracy, to defeat Hitler and save humanity from what they saw as a Nazi fascist threat to human civilization. But in fact, these scientists became tools of America's empire, of the U.S. imperialist goal of forging an American century in which the U.S. would be an unrivaled world power economically, politically, and militarily. It was only a few short years after World War II ended that the U.S. set up its military alliance in Europe, NATO, with the U.S. ultimately stationing nuclear weapons in several of these NATO countries. It was only a few short years after this bomb was dropped that President Truman, who succeeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sent military and economic aid to governments and forces in Turkey and Greece to crush revolutionary movements there. It was only a few short years after the bomb was dropped that the U.S. was carrying out a genocidal war in Korea, responsible for the deaths of some 1.5 to 2 million people. And not only did Oppenheimer and these scientists become tools of empire that was proceeding in the way that I'm describing, even as they thought they were doing something else, they developed the very weapon that could destroy human civilization, the very thing they wanted to prevent. Indeed, the U.S., and this is very important, the U.S. made this weapon a centerpiece of its diplomacy and military strategy in the decades that followed World War II. And many people don't realize this. But U.S. imperialism reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first. Let me repeat that. The U.S. reserves the right to use nuclear weapons, to strike first with nuclear weapons. This is official military doctrine. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. had operational war plans that if the Soviet Union or China took military actions, not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons and armed forces, the U.S. was prepared to unleash its entire nuclear arsenal and murder hundreds of millions of people. In his book, The Doomsday Machine, Daniel Ellsberg, the courageous whistleblower who released the Pentagon Papers that helped raise awareness of the monstrous, unjust, and immoral war in Vietnam. Well, in that book, he documents 24 crises in which the U.S. threatened or considered nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union, against revolutionary China, against Vietnam, as the U.S. was suffering major military defeats by the just Vietnamese struggle for liberation. But the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project had bought into that myth of America as a force for good. It is our responsibility to think and act from the standpoint of the interests of world humanity. To recognize and act with the understanding that America is an empire of exploitation, misery, and plunder. Vicious and vengeful, capable of doing no good. But too many liberals and progressives refuse to come to grips with this, delude themselves into thinking that there is some ineffable core good in the American way of democracy. Okay, there was slavery and genocide, but we're becoming a more perfect union. Or could, or should become that more perfect union. And the other guys, whether they were Hitler, whether they were the Japanese imperialists, whether today they're Putin and Xi Jinping, they're worse. They're the bad guys. They're autocratic tyrants. And so many people who should know better are now lining up behind the U.S. proxy war with Russia.
Again, that was Raymond Latta at Revolution Books in New York. Picking up on where he left off, on the U.S. proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. For over a year and a half, Ukraine has been the battleground for a criminal war between the U.S. and Russian imperialists, with Ukrainians being used as foot soldiers. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians have been killed. Thousands more have been wounded. The homes of millions of people have been damaged or destroyed. The U.S. has fueled this bloodbath with increasingly deadly and destructive weapons and is using this war and the Ukrainian people to pursue its own interests against Russia. Just like the real reason for the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan was covered over, so too is the real reason for the massive U.S. support for Ukraine, which has nothing to do with spreading democracy and helping Ukrainians, and everything to do with spreading U.S. imperialist domination, strengthening its NATO military alliance in Europe, and weakening its Russian rivals. Go to revcom.us to learn more about all this. But right now, a major escalation seems to have begun in this proxy war, with the Ukrainian and Russian armies clashing with increasing intensity over a 600-mile front in southern and eastern Ukraine.
Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, says Russia may have to use nuclear weapons if Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful and ends with, quote, part of our land being taken away. These comments come as the counteroffensive appears to be entering a new, more aggressive phase.
The New York Times reported that Ukraine has launched the main thrust of its counteroffensive, throwing in thousands of troops held in reserve, many of them Western trained and equipped. The Guardian reported that a senior Ukrainian official said every available weapon system was being used by Ukraine in the battles, including recently supplied U.S. cluster munitions. The Ukrainian army is going up against entrenched Russian troops who have spent months preparing multiple layers of minefields, digging trenches and anti-tank traps, and building bunkers and barricades.
For the first time, Ukrainian forces have reached one of Russia's long-stretching dragoned teeth, that's what it's called, defensive lines. The concrete anti-tank fortifications are one example of the deeply layered defenses Russia has developed to slow any attempt to take back territory in southern Ukraine.
Exactly what's happening on the Ukrainian battlefields now is not fully clear. It seems that even with the introduction of large numbers of Western-trained forces and advanced weaponry, Ukraine's army has not yet been able to make breakthroughs against the Russian forces. Neither side has given any indication it's ready to back down. The danger of the war going nuclear, whether deliberately, by accident, or by misunderstanding what the other side is doing, is great. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, recently wrote, quote, "The apocalypse isn't just possible, but quite likely." And he went on to say that the current situation is far worse than during the Cuban Missile Crisis because our enemies have decided to really defeat Russia, the largest nuclear power. End quote. When he talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Medvedev is referring to a 13-day confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1962 after the Soviet Union placed nuclear weapons in Cuba. The U.S. president at the time, John F. Kennedy, said that the danger of nuclear war was nearly 50-50. And now Medvedev is saying that the crisis is far worse. Think about that. The continuation of this gridlock deathmatch would be horrifically destructive. But this entire situation could erupt at any moment into an even more widespread war. And it could more or less quickly spiral into a war that actually includes use of thousands of nuclear weapons possessed by both sides. People need to wake the fuck up about what is happening, the extremely dangerous direction that things are headed, and what the actual interests of humanity are. For those who have been supporting the U.S.'s proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, you are being played. You are lining up behind the U.S. in its attempt to weaken its rival Russia while they cynically use the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder. Yes, Russia is an imperialist gangster who has unjustly invaded Ukraine. But if you're in the U.S., you have a special responsibility to speak out against the crimes of this system, the American empire, the number one oppressor in the world, responsible for more unjust wars, invasions, coups, torture, targeting of civilians, and environmental destruction than any of its imperialist rivals. Making common cause with the people of the world against the imperialists on both sides, and to do so as part of getting organized for an actual revolution to at long last be rid of a system that is bringing humanity to the brink of annihilation. Watch what Bob Avakian says about this in the interviews he did for the RNL Show last fall.
All this ridiculous stuff, people sticking their heads down or, I stay in my own lane. You think if there's a nuclear war, it won't touch your lane? I mean, come on, let's get fucking serious around here. You think if U.S. and China go to war, your lane is going to be somehow, I'm just going along in my lane. I mean, people need to wake up and get serious. This is a contest between oppressors, the world's leading oppressors, with the U.S. number one. Yes, USA number one oppressor and plunderer in the entire world for decades. And, it's up to us to oppose our own ruling class. Yes, we also oppose Russian imperialism. Yes, we also oppose Chinese imperialism. But we're not living in Russia, and we're not living in China. And if we were living in Russia and China, our primary focus would be on opposing our ruling class where we were. We live in the United States. All these crimes committed by these imperialists are done in our name. Supposedly, the army goes out there to protect our freedoms and blah, blah, blah. They go out there to plunder people so that U.S. imperialism can suck the blood of literally billions of people. And if you think I'm exaggerating, go on the website, revcom.us, and read the articles by Raymond Latta, which get into the parasitism of U.S. imperialism, how it is an international exploiter and super exploiter of people in the global south or the third world, the poorer countries of the world, and what this has to do with what the U.S. looks like internally and how it thrives. Even the consumer goods that people have are cheapened, more affordable to the massive population here because of the way that people are viciously exploited. More than 150 million children in the third world who have no childhood. Hundreds of millions of women, like those in Bangladesh working in factories making the stuff that goes to Walmart or whatever. People all over the world in similar situations. It is our responsibility to oppose this primarily, while we also oppose these other imperialists. This is where we live. This is being done, and all these massive crimes, and now the threat of existential threat of nuclear war, a threat to that's what existential means, threat to the existence of humanity. All that's being done in our name. And idiots like, Steve Van Sant aside, now I'm giving him a break by saying idiocy. We have a responsibility to first and foremost oppose our own imperialist ruling class and what it's doing. And more generally, I've made a statement and I'll make it again. The masses of people in the world, and this is very acutely and urgently posed now, the masses of people in the world cannot any longer afford. It was always terrible that these are the people ruling the world, but it's now acutely posed. We can no longer afford to allow these imperialists to dominate the world and to determine the destiny of humanity. They need to be overthrown as quickly as possible.
In line with what you just heard from Bob Avakian, join the RevComs on August 6th, the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, to declare no U.S.-NATO war with Russia, stop U.S. threats against China, no World War III. It's this system, not humanity, that needs to become extinct. We don't accept their future. It's time to get organized for a real revolution.